The footage begins in silence. Black and white film flickers across the screen, grainy, damaged, almost ghost-like. A quiet Japanese city stretches across the frame. Streetcars glide through busy intersections. Children walk to school. Shopkeepers slide open wooden doors as the morning sun rises over tiled rooftops. It is the summer of 1945, and in the city of Hiroshima, life appears completely ordinary. But hidden deep inside military vaults and classified archives lies film that would later reveal a story so shocking, so devastating, that for years much of it remained unseen by the world. This is the story of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the haunting footage that documented their aftermath. To understand how the world reached this moment, we must return to the final days of World War II. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had already ended. Adolf Hitler was dead, Nazi Germany had surrendered, and cities across the continent lay in ruins. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. The Empire of Japan continued to fight fiercely against the advancing forces of the United States and its allies. Island by island, American troops had pushed closer to the Japanese mainland. Battles such as Battle of Iwo Jima and Battle of Okinawa had been brutally costly. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, and military planners feared that a full invasion of Japan could cost hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of lives. Meanwhile, in complete secrecy, scientists and engineers were working on a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Deep within laboratories in Los Alamos, a top-secret program known as the Manhattan Project was racing against time. Led by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and supported by thousands of scientists, the project sought to unlock the destructive power of the atom. On July 16, 1945, the project reached its terrifying breakthrough. In the desert near Alamogordo, the first atomic bomb was detonated in a test known as the Trinity test. The explosion lit the sky brighter than the sun. A massive mushroom cloud rose miles into the air. Those who witnessed it stood in stunned silence. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the ancient Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Just weeks later, the United States prepared to use this new weapon against Japan. The target chosen for the first atomic strike was Hiroshima, a city of roughly 350,000 people. It was an important military and industrial center, but it had largely escaped the heavy bombing that had devastated many other Japanese cities. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the sky above Hiroshima was clear and bright. At 8:15 a.m., an American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay approached the city. Inside the aircraft, the crew carried a single bomb known as Little Boy. Below them, thousands of people were beginning their workday. Students assembled for school. Office workers filled government buildings. Doctors began their rounds at local hospitals. No one in the city had any idea what was about to happen. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. 43 seconds later, it detonated roughly 600 meters above the city. The explosion unleashed energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. In a blinding flash of light, the center of Hiroshima vanished. Temperatures at ground zero reached several thousand degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. Buildings instantly vaporized, steel melted. Human shadows were burned permanently into stone walls where people had been standing moments before. A massive shock wave ripped through the city at hundreds of miles per hour, flattening everything in its path. Within seconds, tens of thousands of people were dead. But the horror was far from over. As the mushroom cloud rose nearly 10 miles into the sky, fires began spreading across the city. Entire neighborhoods erupted into flames. Survivors staggered through streets filled with debris and smoke. The footage that would later emerge shows scenes almost impossible to comprehend. Civilians wander through the ruins with burned skin hanging from their arms. Entire blocks are reduced to smoldering ash. People sit silently among the rubble, stunned, injured, and searching desperately for family members. Many of the victims had been caught outdoors during the explosion. The intense thermal radiation burned clothing directly into skin. Others suffered devastating injuries from flying debris and collapsing buildings. Doctors and nurses, many injured themselves, struggled to treat thousands of wounded with almost no medical supplies. Hospitals had been destroyed, medical staff were dead or missing. The surviving doctors could only watch as patients slowly succumbed to burns, trauma, and something far more mysterious: radiation sickness. At the time, very few people fully understood the deadly effects of nuclear radiation. Survivors began experiencing strange symptoms: nausea, vomiting, fever, hair loss, and severe bleeding. People who had initially appeared unharmed suddenly collapsed days later. The footage captured in Hiroshima shows survivors lying in long rows outside temporary medical stations, waiting for help that might never come. But even as the world struggled to comprehend what had happened, another mission was already underway. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second American B-29 bomber called Boxcar approached the Japanese mainland, carrying a different atomic bomb. This one was called Fat Man. Its original target was the city of Kokura, but heavy clouds obscured the target, forcing the bomber to divert to a secondary location. That city was Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the second atomic bomb detonated above the valley city. The terrain of Nagasaki limited some of the blast effects compared to Hiroshima, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Entire districts were wiped off the map. Factories collapsed. Fires spread across the hillsides. Once again, thousands were killed instantly. And once again, the hidden cameras captured the aftermath. Footage taken in Nagasaki shows devastated streets, shattered temples, and civilians wandering through fields of twisted metal and broken concrete. Rescue workers carry injured survivors on makeshift stretchers. Families search through piles of rubble for loved ones who would never be found. In both cities, the devastation was beyond anything humanity had ever witnessed. Within days of the bombings, Japanese leadership faced an impossible decision. The nation had already suffered years of war, massive conventional bombing, and a naval blockade that crippled its economy. Now, 2 entire cities had been destroyed by a single weapon each. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people in a radio broadcast. For the first time in history, they heard their emperor's voice. Japan would surrender. The announcement effectively ended World War II. But the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not end with the surrender. In the months that followed, military cameramen and journalists continued documenting the aftermath. They filmed ruined cities, injured survivors, and the long-term effects of radiation exposure. Yet much of this film was quickly classified.
For years, it remained hidden inside government archives, unseen by the public. The images were considered too disturbing, too politically sensitive, and too powerful. But eventually, fragments of the film began to emerge. And when the world finally saw what the cameras had captured, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than historical events.
In the weeks following the atomic bombings, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki became silent landscapes of destruction. Entire districts had been erased. Where vibrant neighborhoods once stood, there were only endless fields of twisted steel, shattered concrete, and ash-covered ground. From the air, the cities looked almost unrecognizable, flattened circles of devastation with a single epicenter marking where the bomb had detonated. Yet, among the ruins, hundreds of thousands of people were still alive, struggling to survive in a world that had changed forever in a single blinding flash. The footage captured during these first weeks is among the most haunting ever recorded. American military cameramen, Japanese journalists, and later international observers documented the aftermath as survivors wandered through the wreckage searching for missing relatives. Mothers called out the names of their children. Fathers sifted through piles of debris where their homes had once stood. Entire families had vanished instantly, leaving behind only burned foundations and fragments of personal belongings scattered across the ground. In Hiroshima, the blast had destroyed nearly everything within a 2-kilometer radius of the explosion. Government buildings, schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods had simply collapsed under the force of the shockwave. Fires raged for days after the detonation, turning what remained of the city into an enormous firestorm. Survivors described the sky turning black with smoke as flames consumed entire districts that had survived the initial blast. Many of those who lived through the explosion believed they had been lucky. They had escaped the immediate blast and were able to walk away from the ruins. But in the days that followed, a mysterious illness began spreading among the survivors. People who appeared healthy suddenly became weak and feverish. Their hair began falling out in clumps. Purple spots appeared across their skin as internal bleeding began. Doctors struggled to understand what they were witnessing. What they were seeing was radiation sickness. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had unleashed not only explosive force and heat, but also intense radiation, an invisible threat that continued killing long after the explosion itself. At the time, the concept of large-scale radiation exposure was still poorly understood. Medical teams could do little more than observe as patients deteriorated rapidly, sometimes dying within days despite having no visible injuries. In the secret footage recorded during this time, rows of patients lie on the ground outside temporary medical stations. Many are too weak to stand. Nurses move quietly among them, offering water and what little medicine they have available. Doctors document the symptoms carefully, realizing they are witnessing something never seen before in medical history. Meanwhile, the world outside Japan was just beginning to comprehend what had happened. News of the atomic bombings spread rapidly across the globe. Newspapers printed photographs of the mushroom clouds rising above the cities. Political leaders debated the decision to use the bombs, while scientists warned that the world had entered a completely new and dangerous era. In the United States, President Harry Truman defended the decision to use atomic weapons. He argued that the bombings had forced Japan to surrender and prevented a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland, an invasion that could have resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. Yet, even as the political debates began, the suffering in Hiroshima and Nagasaki continued. Entire neighborhoods had been wiped out, leaving hundreds of thousands of people homeless. Food supplies were scarce. Clean water was difficult to find. Infrastructure had collapsed and transportation networks were destroyed. Survivors built makeshift shelters from scraps of wood and metal, living among the ruins of their former homes. Some of the most haunting footage from this period shows children wandering through the destroyed streets alone. Many had lost both parents in the explosion. Others were separated from their families during the chaos and never found them again. These children became known as war orphans. Despite the devastation, rescue efforts slowly began to take shape. Volunteers, soldiers, and medical teams arrived from other parts of Japan to assist with recovery efforts. Temporary hospitals were established in buildings that had survived the blast. Food distribution centers were organized, and refugees were relocated to safer areas outside the cities. But the scale of destruction was overwhelming. In Hiroshima alone, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people had died instantly when the bomb detonated. By the end of 1945, the death toll would climb to well over 140,000 as radiation sickness and injuries continued claiming lives. In Nagasaki, the numbers were slightly lower due to the city's mountainous terrain, which partially contained the blast. Even so, tens of thousands had been killed, and many more were suffering from severe injuries and radiation exposure. As the months passed, the long-term effects of the bombings began to appear. Survivors developed chronic illnesses that doctors struggled to explain. Many suffered from fatigue, persistent infections, and strange blood disorders. Over time, scientists would discover that radiation exposure dramatically increased the risk of cancers like leukemia. Those who survived the bombings eventually became known as hibakusha, a Japanese word meaning bomb-affected people. For many hibakusha, survival came with its own painful consequences. They faced social stigma and discrimination because others feared they might carry contagious diseases. Some found it difficult to find employment or even marriage partners due to concerns about long-term health effects. Meanwhile, another chapter of the story was unfolding behind closed doors. When American occupation forces entered Japan after the surrender, they brought with them teams of scientists, photographers, and military investigators. Their mission was to study the effects of the atomic bombs in detail. They documented everything: destroyed buildings, injured civilians, environmental damage, and the medical symptoms experienced by survivors. This research effort eventually became part of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, which conducted long-term studies on the health effects of radiation exposure. But there was another aspect of the occupation that remained controversial for decades. Much of the footage recorded in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was classified. The images were considered too graphic, too politically sensitive, and potentially damaging to the United States' international reputation. As a result, thousands of feet of film were locked away inside military archives. Some of it would remain unseen for decades. Among this hidden footage were scenes that few people had ever witnessed: entire hospital wards filled with radiation victims, families searching mass cremation sites for the remains of loved ones, and streets where only chimneys and fragments of walls remained standing. For years, the world saw only a limited version of the story. But as time passed and governments began declassifying wartime records, the forgotten films slowly began to reappear. Historians, filmmakers, and journalists uncovered reels of footage that had been hidden since 1945. These images revealed the full scale of destruction and human suffering caused by the atomic bombs.